The morning Maude Lockhart put a bullet through the hat of the man who tried to steal her horse, she did not flinch, did not tremble, and did not wait to see if he would run before she was already back inside her barn with a fresh cartridge loaded into the chamber of her Winchester. That was Maude. That was always Maude. The town of Drought Crossing, Texas, in the summer of 1882, was not a place that welcomed women who stood their ground. It was a sun-scorched, wind-bitten stretch of hardpan and adobe sitting along the Pecos River, the kind of settlement that had grown up fast around a cattle route and a decent watering hole, and had never quite decided whether it wanted to become a proper town or stay the sort of place where men with bad intentions felt comfortable. There were a few good souls in Drought Crossing: the schoolteacher Mrs. Hannah Voss, who was 60 years old and sharp as a tack, the blacksmith Jeremiah Cole, who never cheated a man on price and never charged a widow anything at all, and old Dr. Reeves, who smelled of whiskey but had steady hands when it counted. But there were plenty of the other kind too, the drifters and the gamblers and the men who had come west because the East no longer wanted them. Maude had grown up in this town. She had buried her mother here when she was 12 and her father when she was 22, and she had not wept at either funeral because crying had never once changed anything in Maude Lockhart's life. What changed things was work. What changed things was a woman who rose before the sun and did not stop moving until the stars came out. She was 28 years old now, and she owned 40 acres of cattle land outright, a small but solid house, a barn she had mended herself with lumber she had hauled from the mill at Sanderson, and a reputation that kept most men at a careful, respectful distance. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped men in the street, though she had good bones and clear gray eyes that people remembered long after they had forgotten everything else about her face. She was lean from labor, tanned from years under the brutal Pecos sun, and she wore her brown hair pinned back in a practical knot that she never once thought to loosen for the sake of appearance. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man named Garrett Foles, who had looked at her 40 acres and calculated that marrying her was a faster route to prosperity than earning prosperity himself. She had seen through that within 3 months and had ended things without drama, though Garrett had left town shortly after with the low grumbling of a man who could not understand why a woman would choose difficulty over ease. Maude understood perfectly. She had never wanted ease. She had wanted the land to be hers and the decisions to be hers and the failures, when they came, to be hers too. What she had not planned for, had never planned for, was a drought that stretched from the early spring of 1882 into what felt like the permanent condition of the earth itself, or the fact that 2 of her best cattle had died in June from a sickness she had never seen before, or that the banknote she carried on a small loan she had taken 3 years ago to replace a collapsed section of fence was due in full by the 15th of September. She had 6 weeks. She told no one about the note. She told no one about the drought-thinned herd, or the 2 dead cattle she had buried herself in the hard ground. She simply worked harder, which was a thing she had not thought possible, and she sold off what she could, which was not enough, and she lay awake at night with the dry wind coming through the window and did the arithmetic over and over until the numbers blurred. It was on one of those sleepless nights, near the end of July, that a stranger rode into Drought Crossing on a gray roan horse so trail-worn it could barely lift its hooves. Maude did not see him arrive. She only heard about it the next morning from Jeremiah Cole, who said a man had come in from the direction of New Mexico and had paid for a week at the livery stable and a week at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house and had not said much to anyone except that he was looking for work. His name, Jeremiah said, was Arthur Stone. Maude had no particular interest in Arthur Stone. She had no interest in any drifting man looking for work, because every drifting man who had ever looked for work on her land had eventually looked at her land with a proprietary gleam she recognized and despised. She filed the name away and went back to her mourning and thought nothing more of it until 2 days later, when she rode into town to buy flour and coffee, and spotted him herself. He was standing outside the general store talking to Hannah Voss, and Maude's first thought was that he was tall, not exceptionally so, but tall enough that he had to tilt his head slightly to look the older woman properly in the face, which he was doing with what appeared to be genuine attention. He wore the clothes of a man who had been traveling hard for a long time, a dark canvas coat that had been good once, worn boots, a hat that had seen 3 or 4 seasons of weather. He had dark hair beneath the hat, a jaw that carried about a week's worth of dark stubble, and hands. She noticed his hands particularly because she always noticed hands that were scarred and calloused and square, the hands of a man who had done real work in his life. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps 32. It was hard to tell with men who had spent years in the sun. He did not look up when she passed, which she appreciated. She collected her flour and her coffee, exchanged a few words with the store's owner Gerald Pitts about the state of the weather, which was the same as it had been for months, merciless, and rode back out to her land. She spent the afternoon repairing a stretch of fence line and thinking about the bank note and not about Arthur Stone at all. He appeared on her property 3 days later. She heard the horse before she saw him, and she came out of the barn with the Winchester already in her hands, not raised but present, because that was simply how Maude Lockhart answered unexpected callers. He stopped his gray roan at the gate and took off his hat, which she noticed immediately as the gesture. It was not theatrical, just respectful. "Miss Lockhart," he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that had spent time in quiet places. "My name is Arthur Stone. I've been asking around town about work and your name came up more than once." "My name came up as someone looking to hire," Maude said, because she had not told anyone she was looking to hire because she could not afford to hire anyone. "No," he said. "Your name came up as someone who runs good land and works it properly. I thought that was worth a visit." She studied him from where she stood. He sat his horse comfortably, not with the stiffness of a man performing confidence, but with the ease of someone who had been on horseback most of his life. His eyes were brown, she noted, steady and direct without being aggressive. He was not looking at her land with that gleam. He was looking at her. "I'm not hiring," she said. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on. "I appreciate your time." He turned the horse. She watched him start to ride and then, against what she would have said was her better judgment, said, "What kind of work are you looking for?" He turned back. "General ranch work, fencing, cattle handling, anything that needs doing. I'm not looking to be foreman or partner, just work." "Where have you worked before?" He told her plainly. A ranch outside Santa Fe for 2 years. Before that, a cattle drive from Abilene to Dodge City that he had joined as a hand when he was 24. Before that, his father's small farm in Missouri, which had gone to the bank after a bad harvest and his father's death. He told her this without self-pity and without embellishment, in the same measured, quiet tone. She found she believed him, which was not a thing she found easy to do with men she did not know. "I can pay you 40 cents a day," she said. "That's all I can manage. There's a cot in the barn." "That's fair," he said. "And I don't want conversation," she said. "I want work." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He started the next morning. What Maude discovered over the first week of Arthur Stone's presence on her land was that he was extraordinarily useful and extraordinarily quiet. He did not offer opinions on how she ran things. He did not suggest a better way. He simply looked at what needed doing and did it from sunup to past sundown, and he did it well. He repaired the eastern section of fence that had been listing at an angle since the spring. He cleared a section of scrub brush near the water trough that had been choking the flow, and he spent 2 full days moving boulders from a section of grazing land she had never been able to use because of the rock coverage, working with a pickaxe and an iron bar, and a simple, steady determination that she found herself watching through the window of her house more than once without meaning to. He ate his meals alone in the barn with the cot, which she had told him to do, and she ate her meals alone in her kitchen, which she was accustomed to. She brought his food out twice a day on a tin plate. She had not said she would do this, but it seemed wasteful not to feed a man she was working. And he always thanked her briefly and without elaboration, and she always returned to her house without further conversation, which was exactly what she had said she wanted. It was at the end of the second week that she found herself, at dusk, sitting on the step of her porch with a cup of bitter coffee she could not quite make herself go inside to drink, watching the last of the light go gold over the flat Pecos land, and she noticed that Arthur had also stopped working and was leaning against the corral fence watching the same sky, his hat tipped back, his expression one of complete and unperformed peace. She did not call out to him, but she did not go inside either. He looked over after a moment and saw her looking, and he did not wave or smile or make anything of it. He simply nodded once and looked back at the sky. She stayed on the step for another half-hour and drank her coffee to the dregs. In the third week, the sickness that had killed her 2 cattle in June came back, and it came back bad. She found 3 animals down in the north pasture on a Tuesday morning, and the sick cold clench in her chest was so severe she had to stand still for a full minute and breathe before she could make herself walk to them. She knelt beside the first one, a good roan steer she had named, stupidly. She had always thought you were not supposed to name cattle, but she had named him Cap, for the white cap of fur above his eyes. He was breathing shallow and his eyes were glassy, and she could see what was happening to him was not going to end well. She became aware of Arthur standing behind her without turning around. She could hear him, the specific quiet weight of his presence, which she had already learned to identify the way she identified the sound of wind direction. "Same as the 2 in June," he said. "Yes," she said. "Could be blackleg," he said. "I've seen it before in Santa Fe. Moves through a herd like fire." "I know what blackleg is," she said, though she said it without anger. She knew exactly what it was and she knew what it meant. If it spread through her herd before September, the bank note would be the least of her problems. "You'll need to separate them," he said. "All 3 of them and any that show early signs. Keep them from the water the other cattle use." "I know," she said again. "I'll start building a separation pen today if you tell me where," he said. She stood up from where she had been crouching. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She turned to look at him and he met her eyes calmly, not with pity, not with the particular kind of hovering male concern that she despised, just with practical attention. "Northeast corner," she said, "near the dry creek." "Yes, ma'am," he said and went. She lost Cap and one of the other 3. The third one recovered, slow and miserable but recovered, and the separation pen held the sickness from spreading further. It was a devastating 2 weeks, exhausting and expensive in ways that went beyond money, in the way that losing animals you had tended always cost something that did not appear in any ledger. But the herd held at 29, which was enough, if she could get them to market, if she could get a decent price, if the weather would break. The morning after the worst of it was over, she was in the barn before dawn doing what she always did when she could not sleep, cleaning tack, organizing what needed organizing, keeping her hands busy, because idle hands let the mind do mathematics she did not want to do. She was not aware that Arthur had woken also until she heard him moving on the other side of the barn and saw the flare of a match as he lit the small lantern on his shelf. Neither of them said anything for a while. He dressed in the dark and then came and leaned against the stall divider, not doing anything, not pretending to work. He was just there. "It was a hard week," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "You handled it well." "I handled what needed handling," she said. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. She was beginning to understand that Arthur Stone was a man who could inhabit silence without needing to fill it, which was rarer than people understood. "Where were you before New Mexico?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked. She had told herself she did not want conversation. "I told you," he said. "Missouri, before the drive, before Santa Fe." He was quiet for a moment. "There was a war," he said simply. She looked at him. He was 17 years past the war by now, which meant he had been a boy when it started. She did not ask him which side because it was 1882 and the question still carried weight that she did not want to carry in her barn before dawn. "What was the farm like?" she asked instead. "In Missouri." Something shifted in his face, not much, but she saw it. "Good land," he said. "River bottom land, grew corn mostly. My mother had a kitchen garden that ran all the way along the south side of the house." He paused. "She could grow things. I never quite inherited that." "You've got a fair hand with fence repair," she said. He looked at her, and then very quietly he smiled. Not a big smile, not performed, just the corners of his mouth turning up slightly in a way that changed his whole face in a manner she had not anticipated, and she felt something happen in her chest that she did not examine immediately because she was Maude Lockhart and she was practical. She went back to cleaning the tack. It was Hannah Voss who came to call the following Saturday, riding a gentle brown mare that was as old and as sensible as Hannah herself, and who sat down at Maude's kitchen table with the ease of a woman who had been welcome in that house for 20 years, and who had watched Maude grow from a quiet, fierce little girl into a quiet, fierce woman. "You've got a man working your land," Hannah said. "I'm aware," Maude said, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "Arthur Stone," Hannah said. "Yes. I talked to him," Hannah said. "Outside the store when he first came in. He's a thoughtful man, careful with his words." "He's a good worker," Maude said. Hannah looked at her over the rim of her cup with the particular expression she had used for 20 years when she thought Maude was not saying the full truth of something. "He's also quite presentable," she said mildly. "I hadn't noticed," Maude said. "Maude." Hannah. The older woman sighed, but it was an affectionate sigh, a sigh that contained decades of fondness. "I just think it might be worth noticing," she said. "That's all I'll say." It was not all she said, because it was never all Hannah said, but it was the most direct thing, and Maude let the rest wash past her and refilled the coffee cups and changed the subject to the state of the river and the cattle prices at the Sanderson market, and whether the drought would break before October. It was August when it broke. It broke on a Thursday evening with a sky that turned green in the west, and then purple, and then a deep bruised black that rolled in from the direction of the Guadalupe Mountains, with the specific slow menace of a serious storm. Maude saw it coming from the pasture where she was checking the fence line, and she began moving immediately, calling to Arthur, who was already moving, because he had seen it at the same moment, and they worked fast and well together, getting the cattle into the largest shelter pen, securing the barn doors, tying down the water barrels and everything loose enough to move. They made it inside the barn just as the first crack of lightning split the sky, and the rain came down not gradually but all at once, a solid wall of water that hammered the roof with a force she had not heard in years. The horses were stamping and anxious. She moved to her mare, a steady chestnut she called Florence, and spoke low and calm into the animal's ear while the thunder rolled over them like something trying to press the earth flat. Arthur was at the far end of the barn with the roan doing the same thing, and she watched him without appearing to, the low gentle tone of his voice carrying even through the thunder, and Florence, who was her horse and who trusted nobody she had not given permission to trust, turned her head toward the sound and her ears swiveled forward with interest. "She likes your voice," Maude said. He looked over. "Horses are honest," he said. "They don't like voices that are lying about something." She wasn't sure what to do with that. The storm lasted 3 hours and left behind a smell that she had almost forgotten, the smell of wet earth, of rain-soaked grass, of the land drinking. It was dark by the time it eased, and they were still in the barn because the door was blocked by a section of fence that had come down and leaned against it. Arthur was clearing it while she held the lantern. "How long have you been here?" he asked, meaning on the land, and she understood from his tone that he was not asking to assess it, not the way men who were calculating acquisition asked, but the way a person asked when they were genuinely curious about another person's life. "Always," she said. "My father broke this land when I was 3. I don't have a memory that isn't on this property." "That's something rare," he said, "belonging somewhere that long." "You don't," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said, "I've been moving a long time. Looking for something?" He paused in the work. Not a long pause, just a beat. "Not looking exactly," he said, "just moving." She understood that too. There was a particular kind of man who moved not because he was searching for something, but because forward motion was the only thing that kept certain thoughts from catching up. She had seen enough of them come through Raydrock Crossing. The difference with Arthur, she was beginning to understand, was that the movement had not made him hard, it had made him patient. The fence section came free. He set it aside and she pushed the barn door open, and the cool, wet air came flooding in, and she breathed it so deeply that he heard her and smiled again, that quiet, barely there smile that she was beginning to watch for without admitting it. "Rain," she said. "Rain," he agreed. She turned to go back to the house and then stopped, because the thing she had been carrying alone for 6 weeks rose up in her with a force she was not prepared for, and she said it before she had decided to say it. "I have a banknote due September 15th. He was quiet. "I may not be able to cover it," she said, "even with the cattle to market." She did not look at him while she said this. She looked at the wet dark of the yard, at the puddles catching the lantern's glow, at the rain still dripping from the barn's eave in a steady musical line. "How much?" he said. "More than I'll have," she said, "even if I sell every animal I can afford to sell. What's your plan?" She looked at him then. "I haven't got one that works," she said, and saying it out loud was the strangest thing, not a relief exactly, but something like putting down a weight she had not realized was as heavy as it was until she set it down. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The Sanderson market runs the last week of August and the first week of September. If you can get 30 animals there and the price holds from last year, you'd be close." "I know," she said. "But I've only got 29 and moving them alone." "You wouldn't be moving them alone," he said. She looked at him. "I'm still here," he said simply. She turned that over. She looked at his face, which was open and direct in a way that offered no strategy, no leverage, no angle. He was just saying the plain thing. He was still here. "All right," she said. She went back to the house, and she lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time, and what she thought about was not the bank note and not the cattle and not the coming drive to Sanderson. She thought about a man who had come to her land without an angle, and she thought about a smile she had started to wait for. The preparation for the cattle drive to Sanderson took the better part of 3 weeks, which brought them squarely into the second week of August, and the kind of heat that bent the air above the road in visible waves. Maude organized the logistics with her usual precision, supplies packed, route mapped along the road she knew best, the cattle sorted and the weakest ones identified to stay behind at the property, while a girl from town named Bess Farrow, who was capable and 17, and whom Maude trusted, agreed to check on them daily. It was during those preparation weeks that something shifted between Maude and Arthur in a way she found difficult to name or contain. It was not dramatic. It was built from small things. From the morning he appeared at the side of the house while she was fixing a shutter, and took the side without being asked, and held it perfectly level so she could drive the nail straight. From the evening she found a wildflower, a single stubborn, tiny yellow blossom that had grown up from a crack in the fence post, impossible and persisting, sitting on the railing of her porch with no note, no name, nothing to explain it except that it had not been there before he was. From the way he handed her the coffee cup one morning, both of them having arrived in the barn before dawn again, except this time she had made 2 cups deliberately and brought them both out, and when she gave him his and their fingers almost touched on the tin, he had looked at her, just looked, not away, not with performance, just at her, and she had felt her heart do something utterly inconvenient. She was not a woman who frightened easily. But that look frightened her slightly, or not frightened, what was the word? It clarified something she would have preferred to keep uncertain. She did not speak of it. She worked harder and she organized more, and she kept her gray eyes practical and forward-looking, and she did not think about his hands or his smile or the way he said her name when he needed to get her attention, which was Maude. Always just her name, quiet and precise, like he had given it consideration before using it. The drive to Sanderson began on a Monday before the sun was properly up. There were 28 cattle that were fit to make the journey, and 2 were left behind with Bess. Maude had hired 2 additional hands for the drive, old Willem Carr, who was 60 and knew every stone of the road between Redrock Crossing and Sanderson, and who had done the same drive with her father before her, and a young man named Dennis from the edge of town, whose family ran a small spread nearby. They were good men and competent, but Maude felt the specific relief of having Arthur at the right flank while she rode the left, because he did not need to be told what to do, and he did not look to her for instruction at every turn. He simply understood the work. They camped the first night near a rocky outcropping that Willem called the Thumb, a great upthrust of limestone that had always marked the halfway camp on this road. They made a fire and ate salt pork and hard biscuits and strong coffee, and the cattle settled into their loose overnight configuration with only minimal complaint. And Willem told a story about a drive he had made in the 70s that involved a flash flood and a man who had claimed to be a minister who turned out to be a horse thief. And Dennis laughed at the right places, and Maude listened with her knees drawn up and her coffee cup balanced on one. And Arthur sat across the fire from her and did not tell a story but occasionally laughed at Willem's, quietly. She caught him looking at her twice during the story and both times looked away before she could see his expression fully, which she was aware was a kind of cowardice she did not normally indulge. The third time she caught him looking, she did not look away. He held her gaze. The fire between them snapped and threw a small cascade of sparks toward the black sky. His expression was something she did not have a word for. It was careful and it was warm, and it was asking something she was not yet sure she was ready to answer. She looked back down at her coffee, but she was aware that her pulse had done something undignified. The second day of the drive was harder, a long flat stretch under a white sky without cloud cover, and 3 cattle that wanted to drift east toward a dry creek bed and had to be brought back repeatedly. By noon, Maude was tired in the specific bone-deep way that came from sustained outdoor labor in serious heat, and she was riding along the left flank and letting her mind go quiet in the way it could do on horseback, which was the closest thing she had to rest. Arthur came up beside her, matching Florence's pace with his roan. For a while neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of comfort by now. "Tell me about your father," he said. She looked over at him, slightly surprised by the specificity of the question. "He was a rancher," she said. "Born in Georgia, came west after the war. He was not a gentle man, but he was a fair one. He taught me everything I know about this land and very little about anything else. No mother to speak of. She died when I was 12, fever. She was from Virginia. She never quite took to West Texas. I think it was too much sun and not enough softness for her." Maude paused. "She was beautiful, though. Everyone said so. I think she always hoped I would be the same kind of beautiful, and she was kind enough never to mention when I clearly wasn't." "You are beautiful," Arthur said. It came out straightforwardly, without gallantry, without the particular inflation men sometimes gave that word when they wanted something. It came out like he was reporting a fact. She looked at him again. He was looking forward at the road ahead, not at her when he said it, and he did not add anything to it or look to see if it had landed. She held it for a long time before she said anything. Then she said, "You don't say much that isn't true, do you?" "I try not to," he said. "How's that working for you?" She said, and the tone was so dry that he looked over quickly, and then he laughed, a real laugh, fuller than the quiet smiles, and the sound of it moved through her like something important. "Reasonably well," he said. They reached Sanderson on the afternoon of the third day, which was the 24th of August, and the market was already in motion, cattle pens full, buyers moving in clusters, the smell of livestock and sawdust and commerce. Maude knew this market and how to navigate it. She went directly to a buyer named Harlan Coates, who had dealt with her father and who had dealt with her in the 3 years since. And she was direct about what she had and what she wanted for it. And they went back and forth for 20 minutes while Arthur stood nearby and said nothing. Not because she had asked him to be quiet, but because he understood without being told that this was her negotiation to run. She got $4.30 a head for 20 of the 28, which was reasonable given the season and the drought's effect on herd quality across the county. Willem and Dennis took the remaining 8 to a secondary buyer and got a similar rate. When the final number was tallied and the money was in her hands, real coin, folded paper currency, heavy with the weight of what it would cover, she stood in the middle of the Sanderson cattle yard in the late afternoon heat and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was enough. Not comfortable, not with margin, but enough by a thin and solid margin to cover the bank note with roughly $30 remaining. $30 was not nothing. $30 was a winter and a start. She felt the relief move through her body like the first rain, sudden and complete, and she had to press her lips together and breathe carefully for a moment because she was Maude Lockhart and she was not going to weep in a cattle yard over a bank note. She became aware of Arthur standing next to her. Not close, not presuming, just there in the way that he was always simply there. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. "Yes, it's enough." He nodded once. He did not say he was glad. He did not say he had known it would work. He did not say anything that diminished the size of what she had done. He just nodded in that way that said he understood. She looked at him. She was close enough now that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular quality of his brown gaze, steady and full of something she was done pretending not to see. "I need to find a place to settle the payment in the morning," she said. "There's a telegraph office and a banker's agent in town." "I know," he said. "Willem and Dennis were talking about a meal at the hotel. You should eat." "You should eat too," she said. "I'll eat," he said, "after you go in." She turned to face him fully. "Arthur, Maude, you're allowed to eat a meal in a hotel dining room at the same time as me," she said. "You're not hired on as a hand anymore. We're done with the drive." "What am I hired on as then?" he asked, and the question was quiet and it was careful, and she heard every layer of what it was actually asking. She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but come eat." The hotel dining room in Sanderson was modest, 4 tables with oilcloth covers, a woman serving from a pot of stew that smelled considerably better than the setting suggested, and a single window that looked out onto the dusty main street. Willem and Dennis ate enthusiastically and talked about what they would do with their wages, and Maude and Arthur sat across from one another and ate quietly and talked a little. And the talking was different here, away from the land and the work, easier in some way she had not expected. He told her about New Mexico, about the particular quality of the light there at dusk, blue and extraordinary over the mesas. She told him about a winter she had spent as a girl when the snow had come in from the north and blanketed the Pecos land so thickly that the fence lines disappeared and the whole world became white and featureless, and she had thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "We don't get much snow," she said. "When we do, it's a gift. Everything you don't expect is more valuable when it comes," he said, and he was looking at her in a way that made it difficult to be sure they were still talking about snow. She folded her napkin precisely. "I need to thank you," she said, "properly. I couldn't have gotten the cattle here without the extra help, and she stopped. Gratitude was not something she performed easily. "I want you to know that I understand what you've given to these past weeks. I've given labor," he said, "for which you've paid me." "You've given more than labor," she said. He was quiet. "What do you want, Arthur?" she said. It was the most direct she had been, more direct than anything she had managed since the night she told him about the bank note. From Red Rock Crossing, from the land, she stopped herself. She could not finish the sentence the way she wanted to finish it. He did not fill the silence with anything easy. He took a moment, a real one, and then he said, "I want to stop moving. I've been moving for 12 years. I want to be somewhere that means something." He paused. "I want to be somewhere where what I do matters to someone I respect. And have you found that?" she said. Her voice was careful and steady, and she was holding herself very still. "I think I have," he said. "I just don't know if she'll have me." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard in years. She breathed. "She's thinking about it," she said finally, and the way his face changed slowly, that smile coming in like something the sun was doing, warming everything it touched, she tucked that away inside herself in a place she intended to keep. She settled the bank note the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp, with a banker's agent who worked out of a small office above the Sanderson hardware store. A thin and unhurried man named Mr. Albright who stamped the payment receipt and gave her the paper with a mildness that felt deeply unsuited to the weight of the thing. She folded the receipt into her coat pocket and stood on the main street of Sanderson in the early morning light with Willem and Dennis making their goodbyes a few yards away, and she breathed the paid-off air which tasted different than any other air. Arthur came out of the hotel behind her. He stood beside her on the boardwalk. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He looked out at the street. "I was thinking," he said, "that I might ride back to Redrock Crossing if you'd have me." She looked at him sidelong. "And then what?" "And then whatever you'll allow," he said. "I'll work the land if you'll have me, or I'll look for other work in town if you won't. But I'd like to stay in Redrock Crossing." "Why?" "You know why," he said. She did. She did know. And standing there in the Sanderson morning with the bank note paid and the whole terrible weight of the summer behind her, she found she was less afraid of knowing than she had been 3 days ago. "Come back to the land," she said, "and we'll see." The ride back to Redrock Crossing took 3 days, and they were the best 3 days of Maude Lockhart's adult life, which she would have found alarming to say out loud, but which was simply the truth. Willem and Dennis forked off toward home on the second morning, and it was just Maude and Arthur on the road with the 2 horses, and the easy motion of travel and the August country opening around them in the particular beauty that the post-rain landscape had acquired. The grasses coming in green at the edges, the light different now, softer, the brutal white heat of the drought broken. They talked as they rode. Not constantly, not with the anxious filling of silence that she associated with people who needed constant confirmation of their connection, but easily, with comfortable gaps. He told her about a book he had read 3 times. She had not expected him to be a reader, which was a prejudice she acknowledged. A battered copy of Moby Dick that he had carried in his saddlebag from Missouri through the war and back out west, and which he had eventually given to a man on the cattle drive who had nothing to read and looked like he needed it. She told him that she had a shelf of books in her house, which she had built herself from pine boards, and that her most prized possession was a copy of Jane Eyre that her mother had brought from Virginia, and that she had read so many times the binding had split, and she had repaired it with leather lacing. He said, "Jane Eyre is a woman who knows her own worth," she said. "Yes, it took her a while, though." "It usually does," he said, "for anyone." She looked at him. "Did you know your worth before?" "No," he said simply. "I spent a long time thinking I was whatever the last bad thing that happened to me said I was." She understood that. She understood it in a way that surprised her with its specificity, because she had spent years wondering if the men who had told her the land was too much for a woman alone were right, and had pushed the wondering down under work and determination and the sheer refusal to confirm their assessment. "What changed?" she said. He thought about it for a while. They rode through a stretch where the road curved close to the riverbank and the water was audible through the scrub, low and steady. "I don't know that any one thing changed," he said. "I think I just got tired of the story I was telling about myself, and I wanted to try telling a different one." "What story are you telling now?" she said. He looked at her, fully and without deflection. "I'll tell you when I know how it ends," he said, and the way he said it told her he had a hope about the ending. They made camp that night on a high flat bluff above the river, where the view stretched out in every direction under a sky so dense with stars, it seemed almost wrong, too extravagant, like something from a painting rather than the real sky above the real earth. Maude sat with her blanket around her shoulders and her coffee growing cold in her hands and looked at it. Arthur sat beside her, not close, but closer than work proximity required, and she was aware of that distance the way you were aware of something that was almost but not quite touching your skin. "I want to tell you something," she said, looking at the stars. "Tell me," he said. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I have managed this land alone and I intend to keep managing it. I don't need someone to ride in and fix what's broken." "I know," he said. I am not a woman who is waiting to be rescued." "I know that too," he said. She turned to look at him. "Then what are you doing here?" she said, and it came out more nakedly than she intended, more genuinely asking, and he heard the real question inside the practical one. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes, and the starlight fell over his face, and he said, quiet and sure, "I'm not here to save you, Maude. I came here because I needed something that I think you have. I came here to be saved by you." She was still for a very long moment. "What do you mean?" she said, though she was beginning to understand. "I mean," he said, "that I was a man who had been moving so long I'd lost track of what still mattered to me. And then I came to your land and I saw a woman who knew exactly what mattered to her and who would not let the world take it from her, and I thought, that's what I want. Not the land. Not the work, the way she is in the world." He paused. "You gave me something to look at and think that's worth staying for. That's worth becoming the man she'd want alongside her if she wanted anyone at all." She held this. She held it for a long time, turning it over with the care she gave to things that mattered, examining it for what it was and was not. He did not press. He did not add more. He let her have the time. "That's the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me," she said finally. "I meant it to be," he said. She looked back at the stars. She breathed. And then she said, "I think I'd like you alongside me, Arthur Stone." He did not move immediately. And then slowly, with the care of a man handling something he understood to be precious, he reached out and took her hand where it held the coffee cup, and he covered it with his. And they sat there on the bluff above the Pecos River under the August stars and held on to each other. And it was the simplest and largest thing Maude Lockhart had ever allowed to happen to her. They rode into Redrock, crossing the following afternoon to find that Bess Farrow had done a fine job with the remaining cattle, and that the property was as Maude had left it, and that the rain of 3 weeks ago had left the grasses coming in green along the east pasture, which made her breathe with something that was almost joy. She showed Arthur the pasture, the new green of it, as though she were showing him something important, which she was. "This will be worth something come spring," he said. "Yes," she said. "If the winter's not too hard." "Even if it is," he said, "land like this comes back." They stood at the edge of the pasture with the late afternoon light going golden over it, and she became aware that he was standing very close and that she had allowed it, and that allowing it felt nothing like the thing she had feared it would feel like, which was loss of something. It felt actually more like the gaining of something she had not known she lacked. She turned to him and he was already looking at her, and she said, "Well then," and he said, "Well then," and then she kissed him. She initiated it. She would later be very clear about this, not with any particular pride, but because it was true, and she was a person who valued accuracy. She stood up on her toes slightly and kissed him, and for a moment he was still with surprise, and then he kissed her back, and it was careful and warm and completely without drama, and it was the most extraordinary moment of her adult life. When she stepped back, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open, luminous, a kind of undisguised happiness that transformed his face and made him look younger and made her chest do something complicated. "Took you long enough," he said. "I don't rush things," she said, though her voice was slightly unsteady. "No," he agreed, smiling. "You don't. It's one of the things I admire about you." What followed was not easy. Nothing in Maude Lockhart's life had ever been easy, and she did not expect that love would be the exception to that rule, and in some ways it was not. There were weeks in September where she was curt with him over small things because she was still, at her core, a woman who had run things alone for a long time and found the presence of another person's perspective challenging even when she valued it. He did not fight back when she was sharp. He did not accommodate her sharpness by going silent either. He simply waited for the moment to pass and then continued as he had been, which was both infuriating and the most correct response possible. There was an evening in October when he came in from the northern pasture with his face set in a particular expression she had not seen before, and she could tell from looking at him that something had happened that he had not yet decided how to talk about, and she did not ask him. She simply made supper and put his plate across from hers at the table and waited. He ate half the meal in silence and then said, "I ran into a man today on the road, a man I knew from the drive in '72. He told me some things about what happened to a man I was once responsible for." He stopped. She waited. "I was 18 years old," he said, "and I was supposed to be looking out for a younger boy from our outfit, a boy named Clarence who was 16, and I didn't look after him well enough and he died of a snake bite 3 days out of Abilene." She looked at him. He was looking at the plate. "I've been carrying that a long time," he said. "Yes," she said quietly. "I imagined so. I wanted to tell you," he said. "I wanted you to know what I was carrying." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He looked up at her. "People die in the West," she said. "Sometimes when we are responsible for them and try our best. You were 18, Arthur." "I know," he said. "I know. But knowing it doesn't always help." "No," she said. "It doesn't, but saying it does, sometimes." He turned his hand and held hers properly, and they stayed at the kitchen table with the supper growing cold and the lamp burning low, and she thought, this is what it looks like, the real thing. The thing that is built from actual people telling each other actual truths. It was December when he asked her to marry him. He did not do it with theater. He had obtained a small ring. He told her he had written a letter to a jeweler in San Antonio and had it brought up by the stage, which she found both extraordinary and characteristic of the kind of quiet, careful effort he put into things that mattered to him. The ring was simple silver with a small turquoise stone set in it, and he had thought, he said, that turquoise suited her better than diamonds, which he was right about. He asked her while they were fixing the south fence line on a cold December morning, the two of them working side by side, with the breath-making clouds in the air. He stopped working and he turned to her and he held the ring out in his gloved hand and he said, "Maude Lockhart, I would like to spend the rest of my life on this land, alongside you if you'll have me. I'm asking you to marry me." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about 12 years of moving and what it must have felt like to stop. She thought about a man who had said he came not to save her but to be saved by her, and who had meant it in a way that she was now certain of, because he had been true to it in every way since. "Yes," she said, "just that. Just yes, clear and complete, the way she did everything." He put the ring on her finger over the glove, which made it ceremonially absurd and utterly right, and she laughed, the full laugh that not many people had heard, that came up from somewhere unguarded, and he laughed too, and they stood in the cold December field with the Pecos land stretching out around them and the sky blue and enormous overhead, and the moment felt very large and very still. They were married in February of 1883 in the small church of Raydrock Crossing. Hannah Voss cried, which she would deny later and which everyone present had seen. Jeremiah Cole stood in for the father role without being asked, leading Maude to the front of the church with a quiet dignity that made her genuinely grateful. Willem Carr came in from his place up the road, and Dennis came with his whole family, and even Mr. Albright, the banker's agent from Sanderson, had been in town visiting relatives and had heard of the wedding and had appeared in the back pew with a proprietary look, as though he had had some hand in bringing the couple together, which Maude found entirely acceptable because she was in too good a humor to argue with anyone. Arthur Stone, at the front of the church in a clean dark coat and a white shirt she had pressed herself, looked at her when she walked in with an expression that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. It was not dazzlement. She had always been suspicious of dazzlement, which she associated with a state that could not last. It was something deeper, a recognition, the look of a man who knew exactly what he was seeing and was certain of his own response to it. She walked toward him and he held out his hand and she took it, and they were married. The spring of 1883 was kind to Raydrock Crossing. The rains from the previous August had recharged the land more deeply than anyone had dared to hope, and the grasses came in thick along the east pasture that had been bare for 2 years. Maude expanded the herd by 8 animals purchased from a reputable rancher near Del Rio, which was a transaction she negotiated with Arthur by her side, but which she conducted herself, which was exactly as it should be, and which Arthur understood was exactly as it should be. He had taken on an additional role in drought-crossing itself, working with Jeremiah Cole at the blacksmith shop 3 mornings a week, which supplemented the income from the ranch, and which also, Maude noted, gave him a standing in the town separate from his standing as her husband, which she thought was good for him. A man needed to be something in his own right as well as in relation to a woman who was something in her own right. She had thought this through carefully, because she thought most things through carefully. What she had not thought through carefully was how quickly and thoroughly she would come to rely on his specific presence. Not in the way of dependence, she was vigilant about that, always checking that she could still do the things she had always done alone, which she could. It was something different. It was the way the day felt different when she knew he would be there at the end of it. The way the land felt like something they were tending together, and not just something she was defending alone. The way his hands on her were such a particular comfort that she sometimes lay awake in the good way, the way of fullness rather than the old anxious arithmetic, just feeling the warmth of him. She told him this once indirectly. She said, "I didn't expect it to feel like this." He said, "Like what?" She said, "Like more, not less." He looked at her in the lamplight with that serious, attentive brown gaze. "You thought it would feel like less," he said. "I thought anything I let someone share would feel like less," she said, "because there would be less of it that was only mine." "And instead," he said, "and instead everything that was mine feels larger," she said, "because you see it." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I feel the same way, every day." She had believed him. She still believed him. In late summer of 1883, Maude realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days, which was entirely characteristic of her. She needed to be sure of the facts before she said anything, and she also needed to sit with the thing privately and examine how she felt about it, which turned out to be afraid and then joyful and then afraid again and then simply determined, which was the order in which she had felt about every important thing in her life. She told Arthur on the 4th day, at supper, matter-of-factly. He put down his fork. He looked at her across the table. And his face did something she had never quite seen it do before. It broke open. There was no other word for it, not with grief but with the opposite of grief, with something so fully felt that it seemed to exceed his normal careful containment, and he pressed his hand over his mouth briefly the way people did when they needed a second. "Maude," he said. "I know," she said. He stood up from the table and came around it, and she stood too, and he put his arms around her in the careful way he had, and she pressed her face against his chest and breathed. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm going to be fine." "You're going to be more than fine," he said. "You're going to be remarkable." "I'm already remarkable," she said, which made him laugh against her hair. "Yes," he said. "You are. You are absolutely and already remarkable." Hannah Voss, when told, wept again and did not deny it this time. She had strong opinions about the baby's diet, about which midwife in the county was most reliable, and about the correct thickness of the blankets to have ready. Maude let her express all of these opinions and implemented the ones that made sense, which was, she thought, the correct way to handle the advice of people who loved you. The pregnancy was not easy, but it was not terrible either. The winter was harder on her than she wanted to admit, and there were mornings when getting up was a different kind of difficult than the usual labor difficulty, a heaviness and a nausea that she fought through with the same determination she brought to everything. Arthur was careful in the right ways, not hovering, not managing, but present and watching and making adjustments she did not have to ask for, like quietly taking over the heavier fence work without commentary, like bringing in wood before she could offer to do it, like appearing at her side when she was on her feet too long with a cup of something warm and an expression that said he had noticed without saying he had noticed. There were evenings when he read to her from the books on the pine shelf. He read well in that low, quiet voice, and she lay with her head on his shoulder and listened, and the lamplight fell over the room, and the Pecos wind moved outside the walls she and her father had built, and she thought, I did not know it would be this. I did not know it could be this. The baby came in early April of 1884. He came into the world on a cold, clear morning with the help of the midwife, a sturdy and unflappable woman named Mrs. Clara Beach, and he came in loud and furious and in perfect health, which was the only miracle Maude had ever personally witnessed. He was a boy, which surprised no one, because Maude had been certain all along, with the specific certainty she brought to most things. They named him Thomas Edward Stone, for no name in particular Thomas because Maude had always liked the name, and because it was simple and solid, Edward for Arthur's father, which was not something he had asked for but which was something she had decided was right, and she had been right. When she told Arthur the middle name, he sat very still for a moment, and then he put his face in his hands briefly, and when he looked up his eyes were bright. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He came and held her very gently, and looked at the baby in her arms, this small, furious new person who was already looking at the world with Maude's gray eyes, and he said, very quietly, "Hello, Thomas." Thomas opened his tiny fist and grabbed one of Arthur's fingers with a grip that was absurdly strong for something so small, and Arthur made a sound that Maude would remember forever, startled and delighted and undone. Redrock Crossing in 1884 was a town in the early stages of the change that would come to all the Wild West towns by the end of the decade. A courthouse was being discussed. The cattle routes were shifting as the railheads moved. There was talk of a schoolhouse expansion, and even of a proper bank rather than the agent in Sanderson. The land itself was unchanging in the ways that mattered, the sky and the rock and the river, the particular quality of the light in the late afternoon that Maude had watched since she was a child. She watched it now with Thomas on her hip, standing on the porch in the October light of his first autumn, the 6-month-old boy who had inherited her gray eyes and, it was becoming clear, his father's steady temperament, and who regarded the world with a calm and intent curiosity that delighted both of them. Arthur came up from the south pasture on his roan. The horse had recovered well from the hard travel of the previous year and was in good condition now. And when he came through the gate he looked up and saw them on the porch, and he raised his hand, and Maude raised hers. He dismounted and came up the porch steps and kissed her, the matter-of-fact tenderness of people who had learned each other well, and then took Thomas from her hip and held him up level with his face and said, "What have you been looking at, Thomas?" Thomas, as was his custom, considered the question seriously before producing a sound that was not quite a word but was heading in that direction. "He's thinking about it," Maude said. "He takes after you," Arthur said, settling the boy against his chest and looking out at the pasture. "Thinks before he speaks." "You do too," she said. "I had to learn it," he said. "He was born to it." She stood beside him on the porch with the October light making everything golden and the cattle moving peacefully in the south pasture, and the smell of supper she had left on the stove coming through the window behind them. And she thought about a woman who had stood on this same porch alone, in the same light, doing mathematics that frightened her. She thought about how that woman had been right about so many things about the land, about her own capability, about the particular kind of strength that comes from refusing to be diminished. She thought about how that woman had also been holding one thing at arm's length without knowing it, or knowing it but not naming it, which was the possibility that letting someone in did not necessarily mean losing what was yours. "Are you happy?" Arthur said, not looking at her, still looking at the pasture. "I'm asking myself the same thing," she said. He looked at her then with a smile at the corner of his mouth. "The answer," she said, "is yes, completely." He nodded, the same nod he had used on the road to Sanderson when she had said the bank note was covered. The nod that said he understood the full weight of what was being said and received it accordingly. She leaned against him slightly, just enough, and he settled his free arm around her shoulders without a word, and Thomas made another sound that was almost a word, and the October light lay over the Pecos land in a way that was, she thought, almost too much to look at directly. Almost. but she looked anyway. She always had. The next spring, 1885, brought changes to the land and to the town. The planned schoolhouse expansion became a reality, with a new room added that could accommodate children through the age of 14, and Hannah Voss, who had been teaching in the original single room for 20 years, hired on an assistant teacher, a young woman newly arrived from Ohio named Miss Pauline Drake, who was bright and earnest and somewhat overwhelmed by the country but determined, and in whom Maude recognized something familiar. She made a point of calling on Miss Drake in her first weeks and inviting her for supper, which Arthur had anticipated. He had, she noticed, made the supper particularly good that evening, which she found charming and characteristic. The ranch itself had grown. They had brought the herd to 42 animals over the winter, a number that made the land work hard but that it could sustain, and they had expanded the east pasture with a new water trough Arthur had engineered with help from Jeremiah Cole, using piping from the hardware in Sanderson that routed water from the river, with considerably more efficiency than the old hand-carry method. It was not a luxury, it was a genuine improvement to the property's capacity, and watching it work the first time had given Maude a satisfaction that she had not quite expected. She had told Arthur this and he had said, "You should take credit for that. It was your land that needed it and your decision to invest in it." "It was your design," she said. "It's your land," he said. "Everything that improves it is yours." She had looked at him steadily. "Ours," she said. He had held that for a moment. "Ours," he agreed and meant it in a way that she could hear. Thomas, at a year and a few months, had become a small person with very specific opinions about horses and a great unwillingness to go to sleep at the times designated for sleep, and a laugh that stopped people in the street when they heard it. It was so full and uncomplicated. He had also, somewhere in the late winter, said his first clear word, which had been with no particular justice, "Horse, not mama, not papa, but horse," a fact Maude reported to Arthur with a dry expression and which Arthur received with undisguised delight. "He has his priorities right," Arthur said. "He is absolutely your son," Maude said. "He has your eyes," Arthur said. "He has your priorities," she said. "So we're even." Old Willem Carr died in the April of that year, peacefully in his sleep, which was a good death and the kind of death a man like Willem deserved. Maude attended the small funeral with Arthur and Thomas and felt the loss genuinely, the specific loss of a man who had known her father and who had been a thread of continuity with something that was otherwise gone. She stood at the graveside with Thomas in her arms and thought about her father, who was buried not far away, and about her mother, who was buried beside him, and about the way loss accumulated but did not, she had found, make you smaller. It made you understand more fully what was still here. Arthur stood close at the graveside, not touching her but present, and she thought, he knows. Without being told, he always seems to know. On the walk back from the cemetery, she took his hand, and he held it, and they walked home in the spring afternoon with Thomas pointing at things with his small, authoritative finger. By the summer of 1885, Maude Lockhart Stone, she had taken the name with no fuss, because it was a practical decision, and because she had chosen the man and she was not ashamed to carry his name. She had simply always been clear that the name was in addition to who she was, not a replacement of it, was a woman who had, she recognized, everything she had worked for and more than she had worked for, which was the surprising part. The land was solid. The cattle were healthy. The house had been extended by a room that Arthur and Jeremiah Cole had built over the course of a spring, a proper bedroom for Thomas when he was old enough, with a window that looked east toward the river. She had her books on their pine shelf and her Winchester in its place by the door and her gray eyes that had always seen things clearly, and she had a man who had come to her as a stranger and had become the most known person in her life, and she had a small boy who said horse, and pointed at things and laughed with the full volume of his whole body. And she allowed herself to know, happy, completely and without apology. There were still things that tested the happiness, because life in West Texas in 1885 did not relent simply because a woman had found her footing. There was a summer dispute with a neighboring rancher named Clement Pryor, who believed, incorrectly, that the new East Pasture water system ran over land that was his, a dispute that required the surveyor from Del Rio to be brought in at no small cost, and which was eventually settled in Maude's favor because her father had kept meticulous land records that she had maintained in the same manner. She handled it herself, calmly and with full documentation, and Arthur sat beside her at the meeting with Clement Pryor and the surveyor and said nothing at all, because it was not his dispute to manage and he knew it, which she respected enormously. There was also a hard autumn when Thomas caught a fever that frightened both of them badly, 3 days when he was burning and quiet in a way that was unlike him, and Maude sat with him through 2 of those nights without sleeping, and Arthur sat with him through the 3rd, and Dr. Reeves came twice and smelled of whiskey and had steady hands and was, ultimately, right that the boy would come through it. He came through it. He came through it and emerged from the fever slightly thinner and immediately demanding to be taken to see the horses. "He is absolutely your son," Arthur said, watching Thomas march toward the barn on unsteady post-fever legs. "We've established that," Maude said, her hand pressed to her chest because the relief had not yet finished moving through her. He put his arm around her. "He's all right," he said. "He's going to be all right." "I know," she said, but she leaned into him anyway. It was in the December of 1885 that Maude told Arthur she was expecting again. This time she told him on the first day she was certain, which was a change from the 4-day processing period of the first time, and which she recognized as a change in herself. She was still a woman who needed to think before she spoke. She was also now a woman who had learned, slowly and against her natural disposition, that some things were better shared immediately. He received the news with the same intensity as the first time, the stilling, the processing, the careful brightness in his face, and then he said, "Thomas is going to be insufferably proud of himself." She laughed. "He won't understand what it means yet." "He'll understand he's important," Arthur said. "Children always understand that." She looked at him. "Are you all right? Are you happy about it?" "Maude," he said, and took her face in his hands, which were warm and calloused and familiar. "I am happier than I have been at any moment of my entire life, and I say that knowing I was already happier than I thought I deserved to be." She covered his hands with hers. "You deserve it," she said. "I want you to hear that. You deserve everything that's good that's happened to you." He looked at her with that open, luminous expression she had first seen the night of the first kiss on the East Pasture, the look of a man who had been given something extraordinary and knew it. "So do you," he said. "I know," she said, and she did. She had always known her own worth, had been clear about it even when the world pressed against it. What she had not known was that being loved by someone who saw it clearly and valued it simply, without wanting to own it or diminish it, was something different from knowing your own worth alone. It was something additional. It was the difference between holding a candle and holding a candle in front of a mirror. She thought about all of this and did not say all of it because she was Maude Lockhart Stone, and she was economical with her words and always had been. But she thought it and she carried it, and on the nights when Arthur was asleep beside her and the Pecos wind was moving outside the walls, she was glad, genuinely, fully, unexpectedly, repeatedly glad that she had not turned him away from her gate that first morning. The second child came in July of 1886, in the heat of a West Texas summer, which Maude met with the same straight-backed determination she had brought to every hard thing, and the baby came with considerably more haste than Thomas had and arrived, with some indignation from everyone involved, before Mrs. Clara Beach had properly arranged her equipment. The baby was a girl. Arthur stood in the room with the expression of a man who had been taken completely by surprise by his own feelings, and he held the baby girl while Maude recovered and rested, and Maude watched him from the bed, this man she had married, this quiet, scarred, patient, honest man walking back and forth with the small weight of their daughter in his arms, and she felt something so large and clear that it required no examination. "What will we call her?" he said. "I want to call her Clara," Maude said. For Mrs. Beach, he looked up. "Clara Stone," he said. "Yes, that's right." Thomas was brought in to meet his sister by Hannah Voss, who had been minding him in the kitchen, and he regarded the baby for a long time with his gray eyes and his father's careful expression. "Small," he said. "She'll grow," Arthur told him. "Like me?" Thomas said. "Exactly like you," Arthur said. Thomas nodded, satisfied, as though this settled the matter to his complete approval. Hannah Voss, in the kitchen later, said to anyone who would listen that it was the most wonderful thing she had ever seen in this particular house, and then corrected herself, and said it was one of several wonderful things she had seen in this house. Starting from the morning Maude Lockhart had come out of her barn with a Winchester, and refused to be diminished by a world that had tried very hard to diminish her. The years settled into their proper rhythm. The ranch grew and held and fed them, and demanded everything they had, and gave it back in different forms. Thomas grew into a boy who was quiet and purposeful, and who had inherited his mother's gray eyes and his father's patience, and who could, by the time he was 4, sit a horse with a competence that made Jeremiah Cole shake his head in admiring disbelief. Clara was a different creature entirely. She came into her personality the way a storm came in, wide and loud and full of weather, and she kept Maude and Arthur permanently engaged and permanently entertained, which was its own kind of gift. The bank note that had once terrified Maude became a distant memory, a crisis from another life, the life of a woman who had stood alone on a porch with her mathematics and her fear and her absolute refusal to admit either. She did not miss that version of herself. She honored her. She understood what that woman had built and what it had cost, but she did not miss her, because that woman had not yet let anyone in. And this woman, this Maude Stone, who ran 40 acres and raised 2 children and lay awake in the good way in the Texas night beside a man who had come to her not to save her but to be saved, this woman was fuller. This woman had more. She said this to Arthur one evening in the October of 1887, sitting on the porch in the last light with the children inside and the cattle settled and the Pecos land doing what it always did in autumn, turning into something that rewarded looking. "I want you to know," she said, "that you were right." He looked at her with a mild and attentive expression. "About what?" "About what you said that night on the bluff," she said. "About coming here to be saved." He was quiet. "I think," she said, "we saved each other." He reached over and took her hand, which was a thing he had been doing since August of 1882, and which she had never once wanted to stop. "I think you're right," he said. The stars came out over the Pecos, one by one and then all at once, the way they always had. The land lay still and wide and patient. Inside the house, Thomas made a sound that might have been a dream, and Clara made the sound she made when sleeping, which was the sound of a person absolutely occupied by living. The wind moved through the grasses that had come back thick and green since the drought, and the barn was solid, and the fence lines held, and the water trough filled in the way Arthur had designed. Maude Lockhart Stone sat on the porch she had sat on all her life, and held her husband's hand and looked out at everything she had built and everything she had been given, and what she felt was not the grim satisfaction of endurance, which was all she had expected. What she felt was the quiet, enormous, completely inexplicable gladness of a life that had exceeded its own expectations. She had told him she did not need saving. He had said he knew. He had come to be saved by her. And they had, between them, built something that neither one of them could have built alone, which was the point, not that she needed him, and not that he needed her in the desperate way of people who could not stand alone, but that together they made something the world was lucky to have. She pressed her thumb over the turquoise ring on her finger, which she had worn every day since December of 1882, and which had, by now, the warm, worn quality of a thing that belonged. "Come in when you're ready," Arthur said, standing. "I'll get the children settled." "In a minute," she said. He went inside. She stayed on the porch for one more minute in the October dark, with the stars and the land and the whole long, true story of her life around her. Then she went inside too and closed the door on the night, and the lamp was burning in the kitchen and her husband was telling Thomas a story in a low voice and Clara was asleep in the cradle, and the smell of the house was wood smoke and coffee and the specific life that was hers. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went in.